A few days ago, China and the United States reached an important consensus in the economic and trade talks held in Geneva. The two sides will reduce the total tariff ratio by 115% each other, of which the United States will cancel 91% of the additional tariffs, and China will also cancel 91% of the counter-tariffs. Such a substantial tax reduction measure will undoubtedly bring benefits to enterprises and consumers in both countries. Of course, the temporary end of the tax increase does not mean that it has been completely resolved. After all, before April 2nd, the United States had just imposed a series of tariffs, and China also took reciprocal countermeasures. Now there's still many measures that have not been revoked, and the two sides need to continue negotiations in the future. But the question we are discussing today is, as the initiator of the trade war, why did the United States suddenly decide to reach a tax reduction agreement with China? And next, will Trump change his mind in a short time? In order to help everyone better understand this incident, let's take a little time to talk about the ins and outs of the tariff war. If you like our video content, please click to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can receive all our latest video content. Now, let's get into today's topic. The matter can be traced back to the Trump administration. At that time, under the banner of America First, he adopted a very tough strategy toward China, trying to force China to modify its economic policies, open up market access, and reduce the U.S. trade deficit with China. And imposing tariffs became Trump's trump card. In January 2025, Trump officially announced a 10% tariff on goods from China and canceled the T-86 customs clearance policy in one go. That is, the previous rule that packages below $800 could be tax-free. This is equivalent to officially launching a new round of tariff wars between China and the United States this year. On February 4th, China launched its first counterattack, imposing a 15% tariff on coal and liquefied natural gas imported from the United States, and a 10% tariff on crude oil, agricultural machinery, large displacement cars, and pickup trucks. Subsequently, Beijing also implemented export controls on a series of key metals such as tungsten, tellurium, molybdenum, bismuth, and indium. Trump was also shocked to see how strong China's counterattack was. So, on February 11th, he found another excuse, fentanyl problem, and announced that the additional tariff on Chinese goods would be increased from 10% to 20%, and the comprehensive tax rate of some products would even be as high as 40%. He thought this wave of operations could suppress China, but in the end, China still ignored it. Until March 3rd this year, the United States continued to increase pressure again and raise tariffs on China to 20%. Subsequently, China announced a new round of counterattacks on March 4th. Starting from March 10th, a 15% tariff will be imposed on chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton produced in the United States, and a 10% tariff will be imposed on sorghum, soybeans, pork, beef, aquatic products, fruits, vegetables, and dairy products. In addition, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has also launched an anti-circumvention investigation into American optical fiber products, which is the first time that China has officially launched such an investigation. At the same time, the General Administration of Customs of China announced the suspension of imports of American logs and revoked the soybean export qualifications of 3 American companies to China. However, Trump's suppression of China did not end easily. On April 2nd, the United States launched the so-called reciprocal tariff policy. On the surface, it established a 10% global minimum benchmark tariff, but in fact, it imposed an additional 34% tariff on China. The combined tax rate was as high as 54%. But within 48 hours, China announced that it would also impose a 34% tariff on imported goods originating from the United States. At the same time, 16 U.S. entities were directly included in the export control list, and another 11 were also included in the unreliable entity list. An anti-dumping investigation was also launched on medical CT tubes from the United States. What's more interesting is that China has also suspended the export qualifications of 6 U.S. companies to China and has launched export control measures on 7 types of medium and heavy rare earth-related items. You may not know that in the field of medium and heavy rare earths, the United States is not a little bit dependent on China. According to the information I found, many industries in the United States are now facing a tight supply of rare earths. And China happens to be the world's largest producer and exporter of rare earths. In 2023 alone, China's rare earth production accounted for 61% of the world's total. And in terms of refined rare earths, China has a 92% market share. Not only that, China also has a complete industrial chain in the field of rare earths, from resource mining, smelting and separation, deep processing to downstream applications, and has absolute advantages in almost every link. It is worth noting that the only rare earth mine still in production in the United States, the Mountain Pass mine, mainly produces light rare earths, and heavy rare earths are almost non-existent, with reserves accounting for less than 5%. China's global share in heavy rare earth processing is almost overwhelming, close to 100%. In other words, the United States wants to find a source in the world to replace China, but it basically can't find one. According to published data, 70% of the rare earth compounds and metals imported by the United States from 2020 to 2023 came from China. More importantly, the United States does not have the ability to separate heavy rare earths at all. And heavy rare earths are precisely one of the core of the defense industry. For example, the F-35 fighter produced by Lockheed Martin in the United States, its stealth coating, radar system, and the key high-temperature resistant components in the cruise missiles are all heavily dependent on China's supply of heavy rare earths, especially the dysprosium iron alloy from Guangzhou. The supply accounts for 90%. The Pentagon once reported that if China really restricts the export of rare earths, the F-35 production line may be directly paralyzed. And not only military industry, but also high-performance electronic products such as laser light sources, target material manufacturing, lasers, magnets, smartphones, hard drives, LCD screens, etc. used in EUV lithography machines, all rely on the support of rare earths. Because these rare earth elements make equipment smaller, stronger, and more efficient. Another example is the key link behind the core technologies of aircraft engines, navigation systems, and avionics equipment, which are all inseparable from rare earths. Speaking of this, everyone should be able to feel that the Sino-US tariff war at that time had reached a white-hot level, but the matter was far from over. On April 7th, Trump once again spoke harshly, saying that if China did not withdraw its countermeasures before April 9th, then don't blame him for continuing to increase tariffs. As a result, as everyone can guess, China ignored Trump at all, seeing that the other side had no response. In the late night of April 8th, Trump suddenly announced, from now on, the tariffs on Chinese goods will be increased from the original 34% to 84%. From here, it is not difficult to see that if the previous tax rates are added, this means that the total tax rate on Chinese goods has soared to 104%. This is not a small fight. It is simply to block Chinese goods at the door of the United States. But China has not given in to the United States. On April 9th, China responded quickly. It also imposed an 84% tariff on American goods, without mercy. At the same time, it included 6 American companies, including Shield Artificial Intelligence Company, in the unreliable entity list, and 12 entities, including American Photonics Company, in the export control list. Of course, the United States is not afraid of China's counterattack and is ready to fight to the end. On April 9th, the Trump administration spoke again. The reciprocal tariff on Chinese goods was directly raised to 125%. This means that the actual tariff rate imposed by the United States on Chinese goods has reached an astonishing 145%. Until April 11th, the tariff war between China and the United States finally reached its climax. China announced that it would increase tariffs on American products to 125% and stated that given the current tariff level, there is no market acceptance of American goods exported to China. If the United States continues to impose tariffs, China will ignore it. But Trump did not listen to the advice. As a result, on April 16th, he made another unprecedented operation, imposing tariffs of up to 245% on some Chinese goods. This figure directly broke the record in the history of international trade. But problems also followed. This wave of tariff increases not only hit China, but also backfired on the United States. In fact, after Trump announced the imposition of high tariffs, many American companies began to be unable to bear it. Many small and medium-sized enterprises encountered operational difficulties, and some American consumers were forced to spend higher prices to buy basic industrial products. However, in the final analysis, China did not want to fight this tariff war from beginning to end. China made it clear from the beginning that it hoped to resolve differences through consultation and avoid harming the normal lives of the people of both countries. When the situation reached a stalemate, Trump gradually realized that he might have overestimated the United States' ability to withstand pressure. In particular, large retailers in the United States are already facing pressure on the supply side. Not to mention the Wall Street elites in the financial circle, the stock market pressure has soared, and the capital market sentiment is extremely tense. But no matter when, China does not want the tariff war to become more and more intense, so it has always hoped to enter negotiations. Until May 9th this year, things took a turn for the better. Since May this year, the Trump team has continuously released signals of easing, expressing the hope to negotiate with China on the issue of tariffs and hoping that China can sit down and communicate seriously. Of course, China also agreed, and the two sides also agreed to hold a closed-door meeting on tariffs in Switzerland. It is obvious from this point that this contact has become the starting point for breaking the ice in Sino-US trade relations. But we all know that, judging from the usual style of the United States, it is unlikely to directly and easily start negotiations with China, and it will inevitably take a tough stance first. In fact, this is indeed the case. Before the start of the Sino-US negotiations, the U.S. government took the lead in releasing two signals to the outside world. One is to announce that it has reached an agreement with the British government on tariffs, that is, to maintain a 10% basic tariff between the United States and the United Kingdom. In exchange, the United Kingdom will lift import restrictions on American products, especially in the field of agricultural products. At the same time, India followed suit and expressed its willingness to impose low tariffs on more than 90% of American products. In return, India hopes to reduce the tariff gap between the two sides to 4%. Whether it is the UK or India, the sudden announcement of an agreement with the US on tariffs does seem a bit too coincidental, and it is obviously a show for China. After all, the US government hopes to maintain a relatively favorable posture in negotiations with China. Although the current initiative is no longer in the hands of the United States, as the world's largest country, the United States obviously still has to maintain its dignity and tough image. On May 10th, representatives from China and the United States held 2 days of continuous talks in Geneva, Switzerland. After the talks, representatives from both sides did not disclose too many details of the negotiations at the first time, but both said that the talks had made substantial progress. According to my investigation, the U.S. side agreed to directly cancel 91% of the additional tariffs on China during the negotiations. For the remaining 34% of tariffs, the U.S. side also stated that it would temporarily suspend 24% of the taxation within the next 90 days and reduce the tax rate to 10%. At the same time, China also made a corresponding reciprocal response to the U.S. actions. According to the information released by the media, the U.S. has canceled more than 100% of the additional tariffs on China. Such a substantial tax reduction policy has undoubtedly brought significant benefits to enterprises and consumers in both countries. Obviously, Trump is still immersed in his own subjective fantasy, believing that he still holds the initiative in this Sino-US trade confrontation and even attempts to force China to make concessions through pressure. In fact, before the China-US talks, Trump had expressed his willingness to reduce tariffs on China to 80%. In other words, The bottom line set by the U.S. side is actually to reduce the additional tariffs by 65%, not the current 115%. At present, the total amount of additional tariffs imposed by the United States on China is 30%, of which 10% is called the baseline tariff, and the remaining 20% is added after the two fentanyl incidents. In addition, before April 2nd, the United States had just imposed a series of new tariffs on Chinese products, and China also made reciprocal countermeasures. To date, there are still many related measures that have not been revoked. So we can know that the two sides still need to continue negotiations on multiple issues. However, despite the current negotiations have achieved certain results, there are still many people who believe that this time it is because China is scared that it actively seeks negotiations. But the fact is that the United States, as the initiator of this trade war, has now taken the initiative to propose a tax reduction agreement, which in itself explains the problem the United States has been seriously affected by this tariff war. So the question is, what have all walks of life in the United States experienced in the past 190 days of tariff war? According to my research, the biggest impact of the tariff war on the United States is the continued plunge in imports and exports. In the first week of April, as soon as Trump announced the imposition of tariffs on the world, U.S. imports plummeted by 64% month-on-month, and exports also fell sharply. As of mid-April, the number of standard container bookings from China to the United States fell by 45% year-on-year. As one of the main entry ports for Chinese goods, the Port of Los Angeles is expected to see a one-third decrease in the volume of arrivals on May 4th compared with the same period last year. You know, the import-export related industries in the United States cover ports, freight forwarding, rail transport, truck drivers, and other links. The logistics industry alone supports nearly 10 million people. This wave of impact has undoubtedly dealt a heavy blow to the U.S. logistics industry. The decline in U.S. imports and exports will lead to the disappearance of a corresponding proportion of jobs. Goods cannot enter the U.S. market smoothly, and retail giants such as Amazon and Walmart have to maintain profit margins by raising prices and laying off employees. As a result, the American people have watched the baby strollers on the shelves soar from $89 to $249, and the price of the cheapest cotton t-shirt on Amazon has also risen by 65%. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the core CPI rose 7.2% year-on-year, with clothing rising 18.3% and footwear soaring 22.6%. Walmart said that if tariffs continue, each American household will spend an additional $3,800 per year, and the lowest income 40% of households will pay more than 10% of their annual income for this. As far as I know, the profit margin of retail giant Walmart has fallen by 6% in 2024. Today, the prices of retail goods that are highly dependent on imports, such as household goods, toys, and clothing, continue to soar. In addition, the trade war has already begun to have a profound impact on the U.S. domestic economy. Export sales of major commodities, such as soybeans and pork, have suffered a severe blow. Official U.S. data show that from April 11th to 17th, U.S. net sales of soybeans fell by 50% month-on-month, and net sales of pork plummeted by 72%. Analysts generally believe that this is directly related to the current tariff policy and trade war situation. If the export of major commodities continues to decline sharply, it will inevitably have a serious impact on the overall U.S. economy. It is worth noting that since 2018, China has imposed tariffs on agricultural products such as soybeans and corn exported from the United States. By 2023, the total amount of agricultural export from the United States to China has decreased by more than 40%. At present, North America is in the autumn harvest season. Originally, farmers planted soybeans, corn, and other agricultural products to be exported to China, but due to China's resolute countermeasures, these products can only be piled up in warehouses. Data shows that the current inventory of soybeans in the United States alone has reached 120 million tons. With the arrival of the harvest of a new season of agricultural products, storage costs will rise further. If domestic consumers in the United States are unwilling to buy local agricultural products at a higher price, farmers and related agricultural enterprises may face the risk of bankruptcy. At the same time, the core industries of the United States have not been spared from the impact of tariffs. Subject to the dual impact of the U.S. government's export restrictions on artificial intelligence chips and high tariff policies, U.S. chip manufacturers are under tremendous financial pressure. On April 15th, NVIDIA announced that the company will set aside $5.5 billion in related expenses due to a new round of government restrictions. Due to tariffs, the three major semiconductor manufacturing equipment companies in the United States Applied Materials, Lam Research Group, and KLA lose up to $350 million each year. Small and medium-sized companies, such as Onto Innovation, are also facing tens of millions of dollars in additional expenses, and the total annual losses of the entire industry are expected to exceed $1 billion. In summary, these chain reactions are having a huge impact on the social stability and economic system of the United States. As early as the beginning of the Sino-US trade war in 2018, China's countermeasures to restrict the import of U.S. agricultural products have made it difficult for many American farmers to survive, and large-scale protests have even broken out in many agricultural states. Of course, as the main opponent of the United States, China itself is not unscathed. As far as I know, since the United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, the production costs of some goods have risen significantly. In order to maintain profit levels, companies often pass these costs on to consumers. For example, the retail prices of toys, furniture, electronic products, and other goods imported from China by the United States may rise sharply. According to the information I have investigated, a shirt exported from China to the United States costs $10 and originally sold for $15. After the 30% tariff is imposed, the selling price needs to be raised to $19.50 to maintain the original profit margin. But in this way, the market competitiveness of Chinese products will be significantly reduced. Although the domestic market in China is not directly affected by U.S. tariffs, if a large number of export companies turn their production capacity to the domestic market due to the obstruction of foreign sales, it may intensify the competitive pressure in the domestic market and cause price fluctuations. Take Gore-Tex as an example. Its overseas business revenue accounts for more than 90%. Once it is hit by tariffs, its stock price tends to fluctuate violently or even plummet. At the same time, agricultural products such as soybeans and corn imported by China from the United States are also affected by tariff policies. These agricultural products are the main raw materials for feed, and their price increases will be indirectly transmitted to terminal consumer products such as meat and eggs, thereby pushing up the daily living costs of the people. In 2024, China's total soybean import from the United States reached 22.13 million tons, accounting for about 50% of U.S. soybean exports. However, this year, affected by the Trump administration's tariff increase policy, the landed price of U.S. soybeans has soared to 5,100 yuan per ton. The price of soybean meal has exceeded 4,500 yuan per ton, and the cost of pig farming has risen to 16 yuan per kilogram, resulting in an estimated bankruptcy rate of more than 30% for small and medium-sized farms. Nevertheless, for China's overall economy, these shocks are still within controllable range. Although some companies that rely on the U.S. market do face the risk of losing orders, China's complete and highly resilient industrial chain provides strong support for coping with external risks. It should be noted that China is the only country in the world that has all 41 major industrial categories, 207 medium categories, and 666 small categories in the United Nations Industrial Classification. This means that from basic raw materials to high-end equipment manufacturing, from daily consumer goods to cutting-edge technology products, China has independent and complete self-production capabilities, providing a solid foundation for economic stability. In the field of basic industries, China's crude steel output accounted for 53.86% of the world's total output in 2023, electrolytic aluminum output accounted for about 60%, and cement output ranked first in the world for 38 consecutive years. accounting for more than 50% of the world's total output. In terms of manufacturing, China's production capacity is also impressive. In 2023, China's annual production of mobile phones will reach 1.57 billion units, and the annual production of air conditioners is expected to exceed 200 million units. Faced with the impact of Trump's tariff policy, China's entire industrial chain has shown strong resilience. Take the epidemic period as an example. When the global supply chain was generally blocked and many countries faced shortages of key materials, China quickly adjusted its production rhythm by relying on its own complete industrial system. The production capacity of epidemic prevention materials such as masks, protective clothing, and ventilators achieved explosive growth in a short period of time, providing strong material support for the global fight against the epidemic. Not only that, China also has a complete industrial chain system. They can obtain the required resources from other partner countries around the world through the BRICS or the Belt and Road Cooperation Mechanism. For example, in terms of beef, under the influence of tariffs, China has gradually reduced its beef imports from the United States since March this year. As of March 20th, the United States beef exports to China were only 54 tons, a record low. You must know that in the past, the United States usually exported thousands of tons of beef to China every month. However, in the face of such a large gap, China did not panic, but quickly turned its procurement targets to Brazil, Russia, and other countries, actively reducing its dependence on American beef. It can be seen that in the context of Trump wielding the tariff stick, China has the strength and confidence to hard steel to the end with the United States by relying on its own strong industrial chain system and diversified and stable cooperation relations with many countries. But then again, judging from the Sino-US talks in Geneva, Trump did make major concessions to China this time. Judging from the current performance of the US, it can actually be said that Trump has already conceded defeat to China. As long as he does not change his mind again and again, it is entirely possible that China and the US will seize the opportunity to repair relations and make up for the economic losses suffered by both sides during the trade war within the next 90 days. And to some extent, the next 90 days are also like a trial period. If the United States can really meet China halfway as promised during the negotiations, China will definitely continue to expand cooperation with the United States at the right time. But if some American politicians still want to play the trick of threats and pressure, China will definitely fight them to the end. Of course, we cannot ignore another key issue at present. Previously, the United States had imposed a 20% punitive tariff on Chinese goods on the grounds of the fentanyl problem, and this part of the tariff has not been canceled. Therefore, this so-called fentanyl tariff is likely to become the focus of China's pressure in the future. Whether there will be any loosening in the future depends on Beijing's specific response strategy. To not miss out on our future projects and news updates, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We will continue to provide you with more exciting and interesting content.